out to me. Well, I'm happy to be here. And from a wellness perspective, our topic today on preventing suicide kind of fits in the realm of mental emotional health, whether for ourselves or for other people. Have any of you ever participated in some form of training on preventing suicide before? No? Okay. Well, to let you know that this is a fairly kind of heavy subject, if you can't kind of imagine. So definitely want to encourage your participation. I've got lots of material, I always do, but that's not what's important necessarily. What's important is, where we go as a group. And at the end of this, hopefully, you leave, well, it's going to be heavy, like I said, but hopefully you leave feeling maybe a little more empowered, a little more knowledgeable about what it is you can do in terms of being useful to yourself or being useful to family and friends, coworkers, people around you. So before we get into too many slides, I want to just quick discussion on, is this possible, this preventing suicide? You're shaking your head yes? Okay. Yeah. Other thoughts? Agree or disagree? Yeah. And the answer is yes and no. Yes, because you bet, right? We can prevent suicide. No, because we can't control other people. And we may not always know the mind and experience of someone else, right? So it's yes and no, if that makes sense. And we'll talk about that a little further, okay? So some general thoughts about suicide before we get too detailed. It's a very difficult and complex behavior to understand because it doesn't really fit in a lot of ways predictable human behavioral patterns. And it's wrapped up in so many different places, whether that's a mental emotional experience, whether that's a relationship experience, whether that's a work experience, and so it can be very complex. So we're not going to be able to, in an hour, give you, all the information that you'll be able to, like, what are those shows, Criminal Minds or something like, those profilers where they're like sitting around this room talking and they're like, they know every thought and word that bad person does, right? So that's not possible. We're not going to get into that kind of detail. That would take years of training, and those guys on the show, that's all scripted. So it doesn't happen in real life that way. But suicidal thought and behaviors can impact anyone. We'll look at some statistics, and you might be surprised. Maybe not. It happens, suicide attempts happen a lot more often than you probably think. If you've ever worked in a hospital or an emergency room, they have on staff crisis workers, and they're busy. They're busy. And there's not really one specific, like I said, with the complicated behavior patterns, there's not just one single clue that says, oh, this person is suicidal. So we have to have this kind of broad spectrum of information, and we have to do our best, okay? Okay. So I want to start with a video clip, and this is a TED Talk. So I don't know if you guys have ever watched TED Talks before. And this guy, Kevin Briggs, so it's about 14 minutes long, which is kind of long for a video clip, I know, for a presentation. But I like the presentation, one, because there's an emotional impact to what he says. And Kevin Briggs is a retired highway patrolman, and he worked primarily in the county around the Golden Gate Bridge. And as you guys know, that's a pretty high hotspot for suicide. I don't know if you guys watched the news yesterday a little bit. There was kind of a piece about Bingham High School, and they have a student club called the Golden Gate Club. And it has to do with a story that has been around about a guy that committed suicide and a note that he left. Anyway, so Kevin Briggs has actually been referred to, because of his long service in this area, as the Golden Gate Guardian. And so anyway, his TED Talk here, it's a good kind of beginning point for this conversation. So, and I may utilize the right of stopping early or skipping some. We'll see.
I recently retired from the California Highway Patrol after 23 years of service. The majority of those 23 years was spent patrolling the southern end of Marin County, which includes the Golden Gate Bridge. The bridge is an iconic structure, known worldwide for its beautiful views of San Francisco, the Pacific Ocean, and its inspiring architecture. Unfortunately, it is also a magnet for suicide, being one of the most utilized sites in the world. The Golden Gate Bridge opened in 1937. Joseph Strauss, chief engineer in charge of building the bridge, was quoted as saying, "The bridge is practically suicide-proof. Suicide from the bridge is neither practical nor probable. But since its opening, over 1,600 people have leapt to their death from that bridge." Some believe that traveling between the two towers will lead you to another dimension. This bridge has been romanticized as such, that the fall from that frees you from all your worries and grief, and the waters below will cleanse your soul. But let me tell you what actually occurs when the bridge is used as a means of suicide. After a free fall of 4 to 5 seconds, the body strikes the water at about 75 miles an hour. That impact shatters bones, some of which then puncture vital organs. Most die on impact. Those that don't generally flail in the water helplessly and then drown. I don't think that those who contemplate this method of suicide realize how grisly a death that they face. This is the cord. Except for around the two towers, there's 32 inches of steel paralleling the bridge. This is where most folks stand before taking their lives. I can tell you from experience that once the person is on that cord, and at their darkest time, it is very difficult to bring them back. I took this photo last year as this young woman spoke to an officer contemplating her life. I want to tell you very happily that we were successful that day in getting her back over the rail. When I first began working on the bridge, we had no formal training. You struggled to funnel your way through these calls. This was not only a disservice to those contemplating suicide, but to the officers as well. We've come a long, long way since then. Now, veteran officers and psychologists train new officers. This is Jason Garber. I met Jason on July 22nd of last year when I received a call of a possible suicidal subject sitting on the cord near mid-span. I responded, and when I arrived, I observed Jason speaking to a Golden Gate Bridge officer. Jason was just 32 years old and had flown out here from New Jersey. As a matter of fact, he had flown out here on 2 other occasions from New Jersey to attempt suicide on this bridge. After about an hour of speaking with Jason, he asked us if we knew the story of Pandora's box. Recalling your Greek mythology, Zeus created Pandora and sent her down to earth with a box and told her never, ever open that box. Well, one day, curiosity got the better of Pandora, and she did open the box. Out flew plagues, sorrows, and all sorts of evils against man. The only good thing in the box was hope. Jason then asked us, what happens when you open the box and hope isn't there? He paused a few moments, leaned to his right, and was gone. This kind, intelligent young man from New Jersey had just committed suicide. I spoke with Jason's parents that evening, And I suppose that when I was speaking with them that I didn't sound as if I was doing very well. Because that very next day, their family rabbi called to check on me. Jason's parents had asked him to do so. The collateral damage of suicide affects so many people. I pose these questions to you. What would you do if your family member, friend, or loved one was suicidal? What would you say? Would you know what to say? In my experience, it's not just the talking that you do, but the listening. Listen to understand. Don't argue, blame, or tell the person you know how they feel, because you probably don't. By just being there, you may just be the turning point that they need. If you think someone is suicidal, don't be afraid to confront them and ask the question. One way of asking them the question is like this. Others in similar circumstances have thought about ending their life. Have you had these thoughts? Confronting the person head on may just save their life and being a turning point for them. Some other signs to look for: hopelessness, believing that things are terrible and never going to get better. Helplessness, believing that there's nothing that you can do about it. Recent social withdrawal and loss of interest in life. I came with this talk just a couple of days ago, and I received an email from a lady that I'd like to read you her letter. She lost her son on January 19th of this year. And she wrote me this email just a couple of days ago. And it's with her permission and blessing that I read this to you. Hi, Kevin. I imagine you're at the TED conference. That must be quite the experience to be there. I'm thinking I should go walk the bridge this weekend. Just wanted to drop you a note. Hope you get the word out to many people, and they go home talking about it to their friends who tell their friends, etc. I'm still pretty numb, but noticing more moments of really realizing Mike isn't coming home. Mike was driving from Petaluma to San Francisco to watch the 49er game with his father on January 19th. He never made it there. I called Petaluma police and reported him missing that evening. The next morning, 2 officers came to my home and reported that Mike's car was down at the bridge. A witness had observed him jumping off the bridge at 1:58 p.m. the previous day. Thanks so much for standing up for those who may be only temporarily too weak to stand for themselves. Who hasn't been low before without suffering from a true mental illness? It shouldn't be so easy to end it. My prayers are with you for your fight. The GGB, Golden Gate Bridge, is supposed to be a passage across our beautiful bay, not a graveyard. Good luck this week, Vicky. I can't imagine the courage it takes for her to go down to that bridge and walk the path that her son took that day. And also the courage just to carry on. I'd like to introduce you to a man I refer to as hope and courage. On March 11th of 2005, I responded to a radio call of a possible suicidal subject on the bridge sidewalk near the North Tower. I rode my motorcycle down the sidewalk and observed this man, Kevin Berthia, standing on the sidewalk. When he saw me, he immediately traversed that pedestrian rail and stood on that small pipe which goes around the tower. For the next hour and a half, I listened as Kevin spoke about his depression and hopelessness. Kevin decided on his own that day to come back over that rail and give life another chance. When Kevin came back over, I congratulated him. This is a new beginning, a new life. But I asked him, what was it that made you come back and give hope and life another chance? And you know what he told me? He said, you listened. You let me speak, and you just listened. Shortly after this incident, I received a letter from Kevin's mother, and I have that letter with me, and I'd like to read it to you. Dear Mr. Briggs, nothing will erase the events of March 11th, but you are one of the reasons Kevin is still with us. I truly believe Kevin was crying out for help. He has been diagnosed with a mental illness for which he has been properly medicated. I adopted Kevin when he was only 6 months old, completely unaware of any hereditary traits. But thank God, now we know. Kevin is straight, as he says. We truly thank God for you. Sincerely indebted to you, Narvella Berthia. And on the bottom, she writes, P.S. When I visited San Francisco General Hospital that evening, you were listed as the patient. Boy, did I have to straighten that one out. Today, Kevin is a loving father and contributing member of society. He speaks openly about the events that day and his depression in the hopes that his story will inspire others. Suicide is not just something I've encountered on the job. It's personal. My grandfather committed suicide by poisoning. That act, although ending his own pain, robbed me from ever getting to know him. This is what suicide does. For most suicidal folks, or those contemplating suicide, they wouldn't think of hurting another person. They just want their own pain to end. Typically, this is accomplished in just 3 ways: sleep, drugs or alcohol, or death. In my career, I've responded to and been involved in hundreds of mental illness and suicide calls around the bridge. Of those incidents I've been directly involved with, I've only lost 2, but that's 2 too many. One was Jason. The other was a man I spoke to for about an hour. During that time, he shook my hand on 3 occasions. On that final handshake, he looked at me and he said, Kevin, I'm sorry, but I have to go. And he left. Horrible, absolutely horrible. I do want to tell you, though, the vast majority of folks that we do get to contact on that bridge do not commit suicide. Additionally, that very few who have jumped off the bridge and lived and can talk about it, that 1% to 2%, most of those folks have said that the second that they let go of that rail, they knew that they had made a mistake and they wanted to live. I tell people the bridge not only connects Marin to San Francisco, but people together also. That connection or bridge that we make is something that each and every one of us should strive to do. Suicide is preventable. There is help. There is hope. Thank you very much.
What do you think? What was some of your thoughts or experiences watching that?
You would never think there. You go there and you visit and you just don't think of it as that.
Yeah. And I don't know if that's just because we don't live there. But yeah, most people probably wouldn't notice that. You know, the number was higher than you thought happened at the Golden Gate Bridge. Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is. Sorry to ruin your travel plans. What did you think about Mr. Briggs and some of the things he had to say? Anything stick out to you that maybe was impactful or that was thoughtful for you? Out of the hundreds that he'd responded to, yeah. So the people he's talked to, that's a pretty good success rate. Although he mentions 2 is too many, right? Okay.
Okay, so I understand that you're supposed to just listen to him talk. I have a great example of a family member that will send me crazy text messages she's done, or call.
Yeah.
And she's just going to cry on her Xanax and everything
Yep.
else,
Yeah.
And it gets to the point that it's like, hey, if you're going to do it, make sure you have your finances in order. Let's not stick on
Yeah.
another bill.
Yeah.
You know, I know she doesn't do it.
Yeah.
But I honestly would come to the terms that I'm sure it'll be that big that she
Yeah.
does finally succeed, but how many times do you,
And this is one of the most hardest things for a family or friend in terms of someone who is kind of always talking about suicide to deal with, because you feel so kind of helpless, and it turns into a frustration. And so yes, it's pretty hard to just listen to somebody. And I'm not suggesting that you don't kind of put them to the screws a little bit and say, okay, let's get you some help, right? Or that you call their bluff and say, okay, well, I'm coming over, or that I'm going to call the police,
you know, I
right?
honestly left her in the car and committed her before. So I mean,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
are going on 20 some odd years of this.
And this is why, and this is, like I said, this is why it's such a complex thing. There is not one thing that you can do that can change that for her. But one thing that might be of influence is for her to know that someone at least understands. And maybe not not from like an empathy standpoint, like I see what's going on, but you're willing to hear her reality, even if it's irrational, because it speaks to her that somebody cares. And that's the influence that I think he's talking about with listening. But that's a very common experience. In my experience working at the hospital and the psychiatric unit at McCady Hospital and doing hundreds of family sessions, that is a common question, that is a common experience. They get to the point where a family member calls and says, hey, and you're like, well, this is the 700th time, so click. But that's the problem, though, is you never know. You can't predict. And so, yeah, you kind of have to do your best to take that serious and be available. It doesn't mean that you're just nice to them necessarily. You might have to have some pretty hard boundaries for them, but you could still, express your care. And try and learn to express your care in the way that they're going to hear it, even if that means taking them to the hospital. Yeah, but that's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. Well, let's talk about suicide statistics a little bit here. So these first ones are between the decade, almost 10 years ago. So these are definitely increasing some, and you can see some of the trends here. So over this period of time, there was a almost 30% increase in suicidal rates for middle-aged adults. Typically, before kind of this time, what's the word? The age group that was typically in the highest risk range were men in their kind of later years, the highest risk. But it's kind of moved down into more of a middle-aged kind of group. Suicide increased among men in their 50s, so that talks about why that age difference has changed. In 2010, there were more suicides than fatal accidents. So it was about this time where, it was kind of always kind of 1 and 2. There was fatal accidents like car accidents and things like that, and then there was suicide, but that has flopped. Suicide is more than fatal accidents, and I'll show you Utah's rates here in a minute, and they're kind of staggering. So the highest suicide rate now fits in this 45 to 65-year-olds rather than 75 to 85 kind of thing. So in Utah, 2017. So if you look here, suicide is the 7th leading overall cause of death in Utah. On average, one person dies by suicide every 14 hours in our state. And we're 5th in the nation. That's pretty high. So suicide is the first leading cause of death for ages 10 to 24. You guys, if you turn on the news, unfortunately, you hear that a lot. You know, a few schools, specifically high schools, seem to be plagued by suicide. Syracuse High School, for one, comes to mind. And they're working hard to try and remedy that. Second leading cause of death for the next age group, and so forth, you can see. 11 times as many people die by suicide in Utah than by homicide. I don't know, what are your thoughts? Is this something you kind of knew already, or is this kind of surprising new information about Utah? Yeah, Utah does have 5th in the nation.
It doesn't surprise me.
Yeah?
People that went to school, there's been so many that have committed suicide.
Yeah.
And it's pretty sad, because like, wow, you know, I used to go to school with them, or
Mhm.
just thinking out. And there's just been so many.
And like you said, it's sad that it's not surprising. We're kind of bombarded by this information that people do this. Yeah. Look at the cost. Suicide cost Utah a total of, what is that? Is that million or billion? Million, probably. Combined lifetime medical and work loss cost. That was in 2010. So not only does it have an emotional impact on families, but it has an economic impact on the state as well. So why Utah? Why are we such a high rate? Other statistics show that Utah is the highest rate of prescribed antidepressants in the country. Any theories? Heard any whisperings about why that might be?
So easy to get.
They're easy to get. You're,
I think it has to do with the pressures we put on ourselves that our children.
pressures that we put on. Yeah.
I think we were raised in a very righteous state,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
and we want our kids to be that way. So
Yeah.
it's not
Moral pressure.
moral pressure.
Yeah. Guilt and shame, right? That's the typical thought, and that antidepressants are used instead of alcohol. Well, that's a theory. We don't. Well, and this is I was going to point out. There was a study done at the University of Utah. It's probably been 2 or 3 years ago now, and the professor found that living at elevation, is a risk factor for depression. And some medical term about there's some kind of adaptation that needs to happen inside the human body to live above 5,000 or 4,000 feet or something like that. And sometimes that doesn't, genetically, that doesn't process. And so maybe living in the Northwest or living in the Midwest, where we live here in the Rocky Mountains, maybe it's an elevation thing. Maybe. So again, we don't have information that says, oh, this is the reason. But what we need to accept is that it is here, and that it is a big deal. We can't just brush it off, right? We have to acknowledge it. Okay. 80 to 90% of people who complete suicide fit the diagnostic criteria for some form of mental illness. Mood disorders are the most common. So that's depression and anxiety. How many of you in this room have ever experienced anxiety or depression before? And they mentioned that on the film, right? one of the letters that was written to him, who of us have not ever been in a low place, even if we haven't been diagnosed with some sort of mental illness, right? And so it's a very common experience. Not only mood disorders, but suicidal thought, more so than others. And we'll talk about how it's taboo and why talking about it is important. And we also find that alcohol dependency is found in 50% of completers as well. As mentioned, people who commit suicide are typically looking for some sort of escape, not necessarily looking to die, looking for some sort of escape. In the best ways, sleep, drugs, and alcohol, death. Okay. So sometimes, I think sometimes we look at suicide as this, walking along the bridge and it's like, oh, I'm going to decide to jump today. But typically, people spend a lot of time thinking about it before they do it. Planning, and not just planning, maybe the planning is less than, but just this general thought of, I hear this a lot with clients, it just seems like it would be better if I weren't here. And that's not necessarily a specific plan, like I'm going to go do something, but that kind of thought ruminates for years for people sometimes. I don't know if you can imagine what that would be like. So, and as mentioned by Kevin up there, the few people, and if you look at, there was recently a video that kind of gone viral about a guy that survived jumping off the bridge. And he talked about this, and those people that have survived, they mentioned, all of them have mentioned, and I've heard this from other people who have attempted suicide, that the moment that they do the act, they realize and say to themselves, I wish I were still going to live. They regret that moment, even though they may not be able to control what happens next. So there's this kind of blend of relief and terror in this idea of suicide. And maybe that's what keeps some people from acting, is the terror side. But if the relief overweighs the terror, it becomes more actionable. So again, there's no single one cause for suicide. It has a lot to do with when stressors, as I said, people are looking for an escape. They feel like they can't get past what they're going for, and it's an escape. It's some sort of, and it's not always related to mental health issues. Maybe we think about someone who's a drug addict or someone who has like a chronic, bipolar or schizophrenic disorder as, and they have high rates within those populations of suicide, but the general statistics are more relatable to us, all of us, than any one particular disorder. Of course, depression is the most commonly associated, right? But what comes before depression? Some of us maybe, stress. Some of us may, maybe there is this kind of physiological thing about living up here in the mountains, or maybe it's some genetic thing that's been passed down for a little while. But oftentimes when looking at depression, there's a lot of other stuff that happens around and before depression. Maybe it's anxiety. Maybe it is conflict with relationships, end of relationships, grief and loss. These things don't necessarily always lead to a diagnosable depression, but they might. Yeah. But and I don't want to cast a bleak picture of if you have, some sort of depression or anxiety issues that this is your end. Most people who actively work lead fulfilling lives. If you have the resources and you get the help and you put the work in, most people it's all of us. Depression and anxiety is part of life. And if we can find the right tools and have the energy and motivation to put into it, we can be healthy and fulfilling as a result. All right, well, let's talk about risk factors. So these are the things you might notice or pay attention to that might say that someone is at risk for suicide. And you might be wrong, but better to err on the side of caution in this type of realm. So we're going to talk about a few categories. The first one is health issues. And you can see here a list of mental health issues. Substance abuse very high, serious or chronic health conditions and or pain. Any of that surprising? When you think about risk factors, are those pretty common things you might think? Yeah, I think that's pretty standard information right there, right? And that's from a mental health position. These are, that's a pretty good list of all of them. So if someone's struggling mentally, they're at risk. You bet. And we look at substance abuse disorders and serious and chronic health conditions. In some ways, those kind of make sense to us. If someone's struggling with an addiction, they've lost their family, they've ruined their health. That makes sense to us. But some of these other ones don't necessarily make sense. And that is painful, because we can't see a depression. We can't see, anxiety issues. We can't see those things. And so that makes it tough. Some environmental stuff. Stressful life events, divorce, job loss, death. Long-term kind of things, and maybe this is where, some of the risk factors in schools happens, things with bullying and harassment. If I feel like I can't get away from those things. And from a teenage perspective, ultimately, and maybe you remember this from when you were in junior high and high school, we're not the most rational human beings at that age, but it's real. It's real. You're losing that first love because they went and cheated on you with another friend, right? Yeah, as parents, we can see, there's going to be many more opportunities for and better love, right? But in that moment, that's real for them, and that's a significant loss. And it's hard for other people to understand. And that's part of this listening to understand piece, is allowing people their reality. It may not be rational, but it's very real. And to accept that is important. So prolonged stress, access to firearms and drugs. Those are the highest. Ultimately, if you're looking for a safety plan, you want to remove any firearm for sure, and access to medications that are dangerous that way. And that increase the risk is access to firearms. Recent release from prison or jail. That's kind of interesting. Release from jail, not going into jail. Why do you think that might be a risk factor? Okay, maybe they leave that controlled environment, right? You bet. There's some stigma. It's hard to readapt. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So it discourages them.
Yep. Yeah. It's a pretty long road of recovery. Yeah. And I don't know if you hear these commercials about antidepressants all the time. And how often do you hear in their disclaimer that it may cause suicidal thought or lead to suicide? Have you ever thought about why that is? Why do you think? Okay, you thought about it though. I think there's two reasons for it. One, whenever you're using a medication, there can be side effects, and if it causes sometimes the medication itself causes a physiological experience that is uncomfortable, and you add that with your depression, not cool. The other part is one of the most dangerous times for someone who is depressed is when they're getting better. That seems kind of counterintuitive. But the reason this is because what does depression do? Depression says, I'm too tired, I don't have energy, it's not worth it. You start getting better. You still have the same stressors, life problems, but now I have a little more energy. And there's a dangerous spot right there. Yeah. So those are some of those reasons. Yeah. Anything, other thoughts on environmental factors, risk factors, things that might watch for that's not on that list? Being exposed to someone else who's committed suicide. This happens a lot with teenagers as well.
Well, I think of one, but I don't think it's so much suicide on it.
Okay.
Especially, I think of it because I went through it. But after you have a baby,
Postpartum, yes.
I mean, it sticks with you for so long. It's so hard to
Yeah.
get out of it.
Yeah.
But I mean, it didn't go to like, oh, I want to kill myself, but it's just, it's hard. It's
Yeah.
hard to get out of it.
And not only, and I think definitely pregnancy and birth is a very, not necessarily high risk for suicide like you're saying, but definitely for depression for a couple of reasons. One, your life completely changes, environmentally, but also physically. Your body goes through so much change physically through that process. That adjustment can be very difficult. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Let's see. Historical factors. So, previous suicide attempts. Most of the time there are some kind of suicide attempt before there's successful completion. Family history of mental health issues or substance abuse, or family history of violence, physical or sexual abuse. So if we know some of those things about somebody, one of our friends or family, then maybe that's something to pay attention to. And that's hard as a family to pay attention to. One of the reasons why child abuse and things like that, numbers have seemingly skyrocketed, is not because child abuse has increased, but it's because it's now reported more often. There is this kind of shame in the family that says, oh, we can't talk about that, we don't want people to know about that. And so, which again, likely adds to a possible suicidal response. Any questions or thoughts on historical factors? I'm moving kind of quickly here because I want to get to the things we can do with the amount of time we have here. So, any kind of change in behavior. So, some sort of dramatic change in functioning over a period of time might be an indication that that someone's at risk, especially associated with a loss or some dramatic change in life. And these are the things like social isolation, a decrease in school functioning or work functioning. These are the kind of changes in behaviors we're talking about that don't fit that person from before. Most individuals do give some sort of sign or signal, whether that's verbal or behavioral, that they have some intent, but it's missed. So this story that's on this Golden Gate Club that's down in Bingham High School, it's based off, like I said, this guy that left a suicide note. And in the note it says that his intent was go to jump off the bridge, but he would not do it if someone smiled at him on the way. He completed suicide. So the Golden Gate Club, they try and lift people, smile at people, right? So they may give some sign or symptom. Doesn't mean that it's dramatic or something that's easy to notice. So we can't get caught up in this idea that if someone decides to end their life, that somehow I'm responsible. That's a dangerous place to go, because ultimately it is the choice of that person. Whether that's rational or not is immaterial. But us as human beings, we have a hard time understanding that. And so we try to take responsibility for it because it might give us a little sense of control or help us to understand something we can't understand. Yeah. All right. let's move on to, so some other things they might talk about it in terms of being a burden or feeling trapped or feeling unbearable pain, wanting to escape. They may not say specifically, I want to end my life, but they might kind of insinuate it, right? So you might have to be sensitive to that. Killing themselves, they might say it specifically. Behavioral changes, increased use of drugs and alcohol. Searching out ways to do it, researching methods, making plans, reckless acts. Sometimes people are passively suicidal, where they kind of want to die, but they're not going to actively do it. So they may not wear their seatbelt. They might drive a little too fast, right? Because somehow it wouldn't be their choice that way. Isolating, sleeping too much, giving away prized possessions, visiting or calling people to say goodbye. Those ones are kind of common. We hear those things. Mood changes, of course, loss of interest, maybe even anger and irritability. Oftentimes, depression manifests as anger and irritability, especially in men, rather than sadness. If someone is often humiliated or feels embarrassed, that's often fits there too. So how do we help? Ask, listen, tell. So there's kind of two topics. There's the asking and listening part, and then there's what do we do about it? How do we keep them safe? And you don't have to read all this. I can send these slides along, but we're going to break it down. So don't be afraid to ask somebody. There's kind of this taboo that if I talk about it, that somehow I'm going to either give them the idea or give them permission if I ask them if they're suicidal. But that's not necessarily the case. The opposite is more likely to be true. So it might be an awkward conversation, but don't be afraid to ask. And you might ask, I like how Kevin Briggs mentioned, he said, other people who have felt this way have had these thoughts before. Do you ever have thoughts like them of suicide? That's fairly kind of just curious and non-confrontational, fairly tactful, and is a good question to ask. So you can ask some questions. Don't be afraid to. Ask things, how often do you think about it if they do think about it? Have you made a plan before? Do you have a plan now? Have you thought about when you would do it? Like today, tomorrow, or next week? Most people will answer. And think about the power of that. Now they're speaking about it. They have someone that is willing to listen to that. The next step might be kind of difficult, but maybe that's the point, right? Just like Kevin talked about, if we have an opportunity to talk to them, our success rate of getting them off the bridge is very high. Any questions about asking? Okay. Be there. Sometimes you just have to sit there and listen, right? And you may not agree with what they say. It may not be rational. But trying to just hear what they have to say, even if they're talking about killing themselves, you don't necessarily have to correct them. You don't have to stop them or give them an intervention, yet. It might be okay to let them express that, especially if they're sitting with you. They're safe, right? Let them express that pain, even if it's a little graphic. And then we can move into something afterwards. But again, that hearing, that kind of connection with someone is a very important part. So again, acknowledging and talking about suicide likely increases or reduces rather than increases suicidal thoughts. Yeah. With us as human beings, we're really good at deluding ourselves that we are the only ones. And so that connection with another human being oftentimes open the doors for some sense of relief, because maybe I'm not alone. Maybe there are other people like me, right? There are people that care. And that's important. So give your attention. Try not to interrupt them. Don't rush to judgment. Just because they're thinking that doesn't mean something about them necessarily. And most of the time, the judgment we're talking about here is that they're going to die right now. And therefore, I have to, talk them out of it or find evidence to support otherwise. And then it becomes kind of like this debate. And that's more like an argument than a connection. And that's not as helpful. Although still more helpful than not talking. But, yeah. Try and control your own fear or shock. That might be difficult in some situations. And be respectful. They're human beings. They're in pain. And that's something that we can honor, regardless of circumstance or choice. Okay. So getting help. Here's the safety part, getting people safe. So you might ask them, will you let me help you? If you have a friend or family member and you say, you should get some counseling. How likely are they to make the call themselves? Not as likely. So maybe you might say, let me help you. Let me help you find someone to call. Let me call them with you, right? Let's call them together. Whether that's Blomquist Hale, or whether that's some other helpline, or whether that is a therapist they've seen in the past, or a doctor, or whatever, right? Let's do that together. Will you let me help you? And then stay with the person, right? If they're actively suicidal, they have a plan, they have means, don't let them out of your sight. If you need to go make a phone call or get some other help, get someone else to help you, right? Here's a hard part. Sometimes we're afraid because people will often say, don't tell anybody. Well, you might have to break their trust, and that's okay. It doesn't feel comfortable, but in the long run, not the short term, in the long run, most likely they will value your friendship for breaking their trust in this regard by getting them some help, by talking about it with other people. Even if that means utilizing emergency services. So if someone tells you that they're suicidal, should you call 911? Maybe. If they have a gun or a knife or pills in their hand, maybe we should call 911. That's pretty emergent. If it's like, well, maybe tomorrow, or that they have a plan but they're safe with me now, maybe there's a different option. Maybe we call the emergency services still, but maybe we call the dispatch line, and we can say, I'm concerned about my friend. I just talked to them on the phone, and this is kind of what they said. You can ask for something called a wellness check. I don't know if you've heard of this before, and they'll send an officer over to the house to check. And if they're in danger, then the officer will escort them to the hospital, right? Or you might just take them to the emergency room to get met by a crisis worker. Go to an emergency room and explain that. Say, I need someone to talk to. We need a crisis worker. Or you might just call Blomquist Hale and say, hey, what do I do? Can we get them in for an appointment? We'll say yes. Okay. Any questions about this stuff? Getting help? How to do it? Okay. You got to tell somebody, though. Get someone involved. Yeah. I would do some empathetic. So the question, I've just got to repeat this. What are some things to do while you listen rather than just sit in silence? I would recommend something called reflective listening, or even just some kind of empathetic kind of responses, like I'm sorry. I'm sorry you feel that way. Or just making eye contact and tracking what they're saying, the typical nonverbal communication or verbal communication, or a specific reflective listening that says something like, this is what I'm hearing, is that correct? Some sort of repeat and acknowledgement, yeah. Mhm. Yeah, or you might just say something like, tell me more about that. I'm concerned about you, I want to know. Yeah, you don't have to have the right questions at the right times. We get caught up like that because it's a pressured situation. But it has more to do with how do I connect with this person as opposed to what's the right question to ask. Yeah, and that actually comes pretty natural to most of us, except for maybe psychopaths and sociopaths. That's a pretty small percentage of human population. So, yeah. So you don't have to be perfect, but those are some ideas. Good. So talk to somebody, supervisor, call us, let a family member know, get people on board. Don't keep secrets in these regards. Talking about it makes a difference. If anything we've learned from suicide prevention, that the more people talk about it, the less likely they are to act. Yeah. Stay connected. So sometimes it depends on the situation. If it's a friend or just a coworker, we might get them to go to Blomquist Hale or something like that, but don't be afraid to follow up with that afterwards. Or if someone is admitted to a hospital, don't be afraid to check on them. Whether that's seeing if they'll allow you to visit in the hospital or afterwards when they come out, to be willing to check on them and acknowledge that happened. Let's not just brush it under the rug and pretend like nothing happened. There might be some tact and timing to those kind of conversations, but don't be afraid to follow up with that person and stay connected with that person. It may get frustrating over years, but it's important. All right. We've done a bunch of these. I'm going to kind of boogie through the do's and don'ts. And like I said, I can send the slides along if you want to read them specifically. I like this one. This is important. So even if you recognize, this comes back to our first question, is it possible? The answer was yes and no. Even if you recognize warning signs and get involved, show care, listen, give people help, they still may do it. They still may act, right? It's not your fault. We have to stay outside of the outcome and just focus on doing our best in those situations. Because at the end of the day, the choice is that person's, not ours. And so we need to stay within our realm of control. We do that. We try to, things we can't understand or things that we can't control, we try to take responsibility for them because it gives us a sense of control, right? If I just say and do everything right, nothing bad will ever happen. That's flawed. But it gives us a sense of control. And we end up in pain. More pain than maybe we need to carry as a result. All right. You can call us anytime. Those are our numbers. You got our cards. There's also these suicide prevention lifeline, veterans crisis line. And then there's this that is fairly new. There's a mobile app that the University of Utah hospitals run that is pretty cool. You can chat with someone anytime, submit a tip, like just from on your phone, text message or voice call, which I think is a great idea because most teenagers especially connect a lot more with text message than verbal, and they're more likely to send a text then. But this is a cool app, Safe Utah mobile app through the University of Utah. Is another resource as well there. Okay. Questions, thoughts?
I have one.
Sure.
So, of course, there's a lot of bullying happening in school. How, as a parent, do you,
Yeah. How to help with bullying as a parent.
to that point where you feel like, okay,
Yeah. Well, one, definitely try and communicate with the school and get everyone on, teachers, administrators on the same board, same team of coordinating, care of that student to protect them. And then I think this listening part is a big part of that. Accepting that their experience is real, encouraging them to, kind of build their own self-worth, put themselves around healthier people, those kind of things. And maybe it does come down to making a decision that, we need to put them in a different school or have them in a different environment. And then continuing to kind of ask about it. Because we might have a conversation at dinner time one day, and my son or daughter is talking about being treated poorly, right? But then we don't ever talk about it again, but that's still happening. And so following up and asking, how's so-and-so? How's this going, right? Asking teachers in parent-teacher conferences, hey, have you ever noticed this between these two? Those kind of things. But it's that being engaged, listening kind of stuff. But there's no right answer. Even if we can't prevent bullying, we've tried. People are people, especially teenagers. We're pretty horrible to each other, especially at that age. And that's a scary time. Yeah. It's a good question. And you might just say, hey, you know what? So-and-so, this has happened to other people. And, I'm worried about you. I want you to keep talking about this. Because if we don't talk about it, I'm afraid it'll get worse or things will get bad for you. At the very least, talking about it helps you to know that I care. Right? Or you might give them, access to this app on their phones. Yeah, good questions. Okay, well, give us a call anytime if you have further questions or have some personal or individual experiences that we could help you with that way. But I appreciate your participation and hopefully, like I said, this is a fairly heavy subject. There's some weight to it, and hopefully that this weight doesn't necessarily lead to, sadness and grief necessarily, but hopefully it's a motivational weight, a responsibility weight that empowers me to be of use to myself and other people as a result. Okay. Well, thank you very much.